There's an old saying, a phrase that is used. I'm sure you've heard it, maybe even said it yourself. That phrase is this: take 5. It means to stop for a moment to catch your breath and regroup before getting back into the action. That's what I'm asking you to do right now. Stop what you're doing and take 5 minutes to let the Word of God breathe new life into you, and allow the Spirit of God to grant you your second wind, to not only face the journey ahead of you, but to finish strong. The clock is already ticking, so let's get started. Most of us men wouldn't admit it, but what other men think of us, their judgment of us, can be a big deal in our lives. But it doesn't have to be. And I was reminded of that in my quiet time this morning in 1 Samuel 16 and 17, looking at David's life. Starting in verse 16, Samuel is sent of the Lord to Jesse's house, who had 8 sons, to choose a king to replace Saul. He told Jesse to sanctify himself and his sons and come to the sacrifice. Well, Jesse showed up with 7 of his sons. And Samuel went through every one of those sons, starting with the eldest, and the Lord said, "This is not the one." Finally, Samuel says, "Are all these your children?" And his father, Jesse, David's father, said, "There's one other. He is the youngest. He's keeping the sheep." That word youngest there is katan in the Hebrew. It means insignificant or unimportant. David was depreciated by his father. Well, we get to chapter 17, and the 3 eldest sons are in a battle with Saul against the Philistines. And Jesse sends David to check on them to see how they're doing. And he shows up, and when he gets there, he hears Goliath come down in the valley and defy the armies of God and of Israel. And he begins to talk about, well, what can happen and what's going on and what will happen to the guy who defeats this giant. And his elder brother shows up and he says, "Why did you come here? And who's taking care of those sheep? I know your pride and your naughtiness. You just came here to see a battle." And David says, "What have I now done? Is there not a cause?" And he turned to another and started talking. That's a whole different study all of its own, but we'll just leave it there. He was despised of his brother. Later on, he's talking to these guys, and what he says makes it to Saul. Saul sends for him. He goes to Saul and he says, "Don't let any man's heart be troubled about this man. I'll go and fight him." And Saul, the king, says, "You're not able to fight him. You're just a youth." And he's been a man of war from his youth. David says, "Hey, I kept my father's sheep, and a lion came out and a bear came out. And the same Lord that delivered me from the lion and the bear will deliver me from this uncircumcised Philistine." He was dismissed by Saul. Then he went out to battle against Goliath. And Goliath sees him and says, "Am I a dog that you come against me with staves?" And he cursed David by his gods. And he says, "You come to me and I'm going to feed your flesh to the fowl of the air and to the beast of the field." And then David says to him, "You come against me with a sword and a shield. I come against you in the name of the Lord." He defeats Goliath. He was disdained by the giant. He was depreciated by his father, despised by his brother. He was dismissed by Saul, and he was disdained by the giant, and yet none of these things moved him. The Bible tells us in Proverbs 29:25 that the fear of man is a snare. And I'm reminded of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 3. He says, "But with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged of you or of man's judgment. Yea, I judge not mine own self." And then later he says, "He that judgeth me is the Lord." Now, what is God's judgment of us? The Bible tells us that we are the apple of his eye. The Bible tells us that he says, "I know the thoughts that I think towards you, thoughts of good and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope." In the Psalm 139, he says, "You are fearfully and wonderfully made." Paul says he commended his love toward us and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. See, David was depreciated by his father. He was despised by his brother. He was dismissed by Saul. He was disdained by the giant, his enemy. But he knew, like Paul, he was dear unto his God. And Paul says, what these men think, well, that's a very small thing. But what God thinks of me, that is a big thing. And I would encourage you, men, keep your mind and eyes on the big thing. Hey guys, be sure to click like and subscribe if this video helped you. And most importantly, share it with someone you think would benefit from a spiritual breather themselves. God bless you. I'll catch you on our next break.